Commander James Caldwell stepped into the pre-dawn twilight, a mug of steaming coffee in one hand, his other resting on the grip of a sidearm. The mornings on this forgotten planet were colder than he liked, but he had grown accustomed to the chill that seeped into his bones. It was, after all, a lonely post, remote, unpopulated, and quiet enough that the smallest sound could carry for miles. James took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, his breath fogging in the icy air. He was just about to start his morning patrol when a sharp, crackling noise cut through the silence. It wasn't thunder, nor the groan of shifting ground. This was something else, something metallic. Great. What now? James set his mug down on the edge of the makeshift workbench outside his outpost and scanned the horizon. His hand drifted to his belt, unclipping his binoculars. Through the lenses, he spotted a faint trail of smoke curling upward from behind a distant ridge. "Better not be a crash," he said aloud, though no one was around to hear. It had been years since anyone else had set foot on this planet, as far as he knew. If something had gone down, it meant trouble. And trouble was the last thing James wanted. But curiosity and duty won out. He grabbed his pack, double-checked his weapon, and set off toward the ridge. The trek was long and treacherous. The planet's surface was littered with jagged rocks and unpredictable sinkholes. By the time James reached the source of the smoke, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the terrain. It was, in fact, a crash. A small alien craft lay crumpled in a shallow ravine, its sleek hull scarred and smoldering. Sparks spit from damaged panels, and a faint, high-pitched whine emanated from its core. James approached cautiously, hand on his sidearm. "Hello?" he called out, his voice firm but not hostile. "Anyone alive in there?" A groan answered him. James's stomach tightened. He climbed down the edge of the ravine, boots slipping on loose gravel. Inside the shattered cockpit, he saw the pilot, a silver-skinned alien figure slumped over the controls. Her features were delicate but unfamiliar, her limbs elongated, her frame covered in a form-fitting suit that had clearly seen better days. She opened her eyes, a striking luminous gold that locked onto James's. "You," she began, her voice a low, melodic hum. "Easy," James said, raising a hand. "I'm not here to hurt you. Can you move?" The alien woman grimaced, her hand fluttering to her side. "I can try." James quickly assessed her injuries. Nothing looked immediately life-threatening, but she'd definitely taken a hit. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small med kit. "I'm going to help you. Just hold still." Her eyes narrowed, but she nodded. James worked swiftly, patching up a gash on her arm and wrapping a compression bandage around her torso. She winced but didn't resist. Once he'd done what he could, he stepped back. "Can you stand?" She nodded again, bracing herself against the cockpit's frame. With James's help, she climbed out of the wreckage, her movements slow and deliberate. "I have a station not far from here," James said. "You'll be safer there." She hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "If you mean to harm me." "I don't," James cut in. "Come on, let's get you patched up properly." They set off toward the outpost, James keeping an eye on her as she limped alongside him. He noticed how her gaze constantly darted around, taking in her surroundings. It wasn't just caution, it was curiosity. "Name's James," he offered. "You got a name?" She looked at him for a moment before replying. "Tanith." "All right, Tanith. Let's see if we can figure out how you ended up in this mess." The walk was slow but steady. James tried to keep the conversation light, asking her questions about her ship, her home, anything that might help him understand her situation. Tanith's answers were brief, her voice measured, but she did respond. By the time they reached the outpost, the sun was high in the sky. James guided her inside, offering her a seat at the small, cluttered table that served as both his dining area and his workbench. "Here." He handed her a water bottle. "Drink. You look like you need it." Tanith accepted it cautiously, taking a small sip before setting it down. Her golden eyes roamed the room, landing on the array of tools, data pads, and half-finished projects scattered around. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Just me and the walls," James replied. "Though I'd kill for some decent company." He smiled faintly, trying to ease the tension. Tanith tilted her head, studying him. "You helped me." "Why?" James shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. She didn't respond right away, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Thank you," she said at last. "Don't mention it." James set about gathering supplies to properly treat her injuries. As he worked, he tried to get a better sense of who she was. "So, Tanith, where are you from?" She hesitated before answering. "A long way from here." "Fair enough. Why were you flying over this planet?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I was escaping." "Escaping what?" She looked away, her fingers tightening around the water bottle. "That is not something I wish to discuss." James decided not to press. Instead, he focused on patching her up. Once he'd finished, he offered her a small plate of rations. "Not exactly gourmet," he said, "but it's food." Tanith accepted it without comment. As she ate, James sat across from her, sipping his coffee. For a long time, they were silent, the only sound the faint hum of the outpost's generators. "You're not what I expected," Tanith said suddenly. James raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what were you expecting?" "Not kindness." James chuckled. "Well, I've got plenty of that to go around." Tanith's lips quirked into the barest hint of a smile. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Maybe I've just been alone too long," James continued. "When someone shows up out of nowhere, it feels good to have someone else to talk to." Tanith's gaze softened. "I suppose I should be grateful that you were the one to find me." "Damn right you should," James said with a grin. "I'm the best company on this rock." That earned him a soft chuckle from Tanith. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the barren landscape. "So, what's your plan now?" "I don't know," Tanith admitted. "My ship is destroyed. I cannot return to my world. I suppose I will have to figure that out." "Well, you're welcome to stay here for a while," James said. "At least until you figure something out. I've got an extra cot and we can scavenge the wreckage for anything useful." Tanith nodded slowly. "Thank you. I think I will accept that offer." James raised his mug in a mock toast. "To new neighbors." Tanith regarded him for a moment, then very faintly returned the gesture with her own water bottle. The beginnings of an alliance, albeit an uneasy one, had been formed. It had been a few days since Tanith arrived at the outpost. James found himself adjusting surprisingly quickly to her presence. For the first time in months, he had someone to talk to, someone who offered more than the echoes of his own thoughts. Even if her responses were curt, her observations sharp, it was something. He noticed how her eyes seemed to always be calculating, scanning every tool he used, every scrap of tech strewn about. One morning, James stood at the workbench tinkering with a worn-out atmospheric monitor. He glanced over to where Tanith was examining one of the salvaged data pads he had lying around. She tapped at it cautiously, clearly unfamiliar with human interfaces. "You break that, you buy it," James called out, a smirk tugging at his lips. She didn't look up. "I'm not so sure your technology is worth the effort." "Hey now, that technology has kept me alive out here." James set down his screwdriver and walked over, glancing at the data pad she held. "Having any luck?" "Your files are disorganized," she replied, frowning at the screen. "Do you have a central database, or is everything scattered across these primitive devices?" James laughed. "Sorry, we can't all have shiny alien supercomputers. If you want to help me reorganize, be my guest." Tanith raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps I will. Your methods are inefficient." "Yeah, well, I never thought I'd have a guest who cared," James said, still smiling. "If you've got a better way, I'm all ears." Tanith gave him a pointed look but said nothing further. Instead, she placed the data pad back on the table and stood brushing imaginary dust off her suit. "I'd like to see more of this planet," she said. "You sure?" "It's not exactly a paradise out there," James replied. "I'm aware, but I won't learn anything staying cooped up here." James considered this for a moment. "All right," he said finally. "But we stick together. The terrain can be rough and the wildlife isn't always friendly." Tanith inclined her head. "Understood." The two of them packed a few supplies, water, emergency kits, a basic field scanner, and James's old plasma pistol. Tanith noted its design with mild amusement, but she didn't comment. James caught her smirking once or twice and couldn't help but grin in return. "Just wait till you see me shoot," he said. "You'll be impressed." "I'll believe it when I see it," she replied dryly. They set out under a pale sky, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. James led the way at first, pointing out rocky outcroppings and crevices that had tripped him up in the past. As they walked, Tanith began to ask questions not about Earth or human culture, but about the planet itself. "What have you observed about the local ecosystem?" she asked. James shrugged. "Not much. I've seen a few different types of wildlife, nothing that seemed too organized, though. Mostly scavengers and small predators. The plant life's tough, too. Not a lot of variety. And the atmosphere? Stable enough. It's why we set up here in the first place. There's oxygen, though not as much as Earth. You get used to breathing it after a while. The big problem is the storms. They roll in fast and hit hard. You don't want to be caught out when that happens." Tanith nodded, taking in his words. "It sounds harsh." "It is. But it's quiet, too. No politics, no bureaucracy. Just the planet and me. Well, now you, I guess." She glanced at him. "You don't miss your home?" James was silent for a moment, then shrugged. "I miss people sometimes. But Earth, it's complicated. It's not the place I remember." Tanith didn't press further, and they continued walking. They reached a wide, rocky plain by mid-afternoon. Tanith knelt to examine a cluster of low, thorny plants that seemed to thrive in the cracks between boulders. James leaned on a nearby rock, watching her. "Those are tough little things," he said. "I've seen them survive all kinds of weather." "They must have a strong root system," Tanith said, carefully removing a small blade-like tool from her belt and cutting one of the plants at the stem. She studied the cut section, noting the thick, fibrous interior. "Plan on making a salad?" James joked. Tanith shot him a dry look. "I'm examining the structure. These plants could be useful." "For what?" "Several possibilities," she replied. "They could be a source of fuel, medicine, or even insulation if their fibers are treated properly." James gave a low whistle. "You're thorough." "I was trained to be," she said simply. James felt a pang of curiosity about that training, but he decided to let the subject drop. He didn't want to push her too far too quickly. Instead, he turned his attention to a nearby rock formation. "We should check those caves before it gets dark," he said. "Might find something useful, or at least a place to rest if we're caught out here too long." Tanith nodded, and they set off again. As they neared the caves, James noticed strange markings on the stone walls. Patterns that didn't appear natural. "Look at this," he said, gesturing for Tanith to join him. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" She studied the markings closely, her golden eyes narrowing. "These aren't random," she said. "Someone or something made these intentionally." "Could be old mining marks," James said, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," Tanith replied. "They're too precise, too deliberate. This was done by a sentient hand." James frowned. "You think someone's been here before us?" Tanith glanced at him. "It's possible. Or they may still be here." A chill ran down James's spine, but he shook it off. "Let's keep moving. Just stay alert." Inside the cave, they found more of the markings, as well as scattered fragments of what appeared to be broken tools. James picked up a shard of what looked like ceramic, turning it over in his hands. "This doesn't look like anything I've seen before," he said. Tanith crouched beside him, taking the shard and examining it under the beam of a small light. "It's not from my ship," she said. "And it's not human. That much I can tell you." "Then what is it?" Tanith didn't answer immediately. She stood, looking deeper into the cave. "I don't know, but I think we should find out." James followed her gaze, his grip tightening on his pistol. "I hope whoever left this stuff isn't still hanging around." Tanith smiled faintly. "If they are, I'll deal with them." "Deal with them? And here I thought you were just a pilot." She glanced at him. "I never said I was just a pilot." James chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, you're full of surprises." They pressed deeper into the cave, the air growing colder and the walls narrowing. James felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. Whatever had been here before was long gone, or so he hoped. But the markings, the broken tools, and the stillness of the place hinted at a story he couldn't yet piece together. Tanith stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. James froze. "What is it?" he whispered. She pointed to the ground. There were faint tracks in the dirt, footprints, small but unmistakably deliberate. James felt his pulse quicken. "Looks like someone was here not too long ago," he murmured. Tanith nodded. "We need to move carefully. No telling what we'll find." James gripped his weapon, following Tanith's lead as they moved deeper into the unknown. James woke to the sound of something clattering outside the outpost. He groaned, throwing his legs over the edge of the cot and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Tanith wasn't in her cot, and the morning sun was already spilling in through the small window. "Great," he muttered, pulling on his boots. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the crisp morning air, scanning the area. Tanith was crouched by the workbench, carefully dismantling a small piece of equipment she must have scavenged from her ship. Bits of circuitry and wiring were strewn about, and she was entirely focused on what she was doing. "You know," James said, stretching his arms over his head, "most people start the day with breakfast, not a tech project." Tanith didn't look up. "I find it more efficient to begin work early." "Efficient, huh? You're missing out on the most important meal of the day." He walked over, leaning on the bench to get a better look. "What's all this?" "A signal booster," she said simply. "It won't get me far, but it might extend our communication range enough to detect any nearby traffic." James frowned. "Nearby traffic? You think someone else is out there?" Tanith paused, finally meeting his eyes. "It's possible. And if there is anyone, I'd like to know before they find us." He considered her words. "Fair point. Let me know if you need help with it." "You." She raised an eyebrow. "You think you can handle this level of technology?" James smirked. "Hey, I've put together my share of patchwork repairs. Maybe I'm not fluent in alien tech, but I'm no rookie either." Tanith stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine. Hand me that connector," she said, nodding toward a small piece of metal. James picked it up and handed it over. "See? Not so useless after all." She didn't reply, but there was a faint twitch of her lips that he decided to count as a smile. As they worked, James couldn't help but notice how comfortable the silence had become. A week ago, Tanith barely spoke to him. Now, their quiet cooperation felt natural. It wasn't that they were best friends, far from it, but there was a mutual understanding growing between them. "So," James said after a while, "what's the plan if we do pick up a signal?" Tanith connected a wire, her movements precise. "We evaluate who it is. If it's a threat, we hide. If it's a potential ally, we make contact. And if it's your people," he asked carefully. Tanith paused, her fingers resting on the booster's casing. "Then we see if they're friend or foe." "Not exactly a reassuring answer," James said, crossing his arms. She looked at him, her golden eyes sharp. "I don't have the luxury of assuming the best. Not after what I've seen." James sighed. "Fair enough." They worked in silence for a while longer, James occasionally fetching tools or holding parts in place while Tanith completed the finer adjustments. He was no expert, but he had steady hands, and Tanith seemed to appreciate that. "Pass me that soldering iron," she said, holding out her hand. James placed it in her palm, then leaned back against the workbench watching her work. "You're good at this," he said. "It was part of my training," she replied without looking up. "All warriors learn basic engineering." "Warriors, huh? You never really told me much about that." Tanith glanced at him briefly, then returned to the signal booster. "There's not much to tell. I was trained to fight, to fix what's broken, to survive." "Sounds like a lot to carry," James said softly. She paused for just a moment before continuing. "It was necessary." James didn't push further. Instead, he picked up a small screwdriver and adjusted a loose panel on another piece of equipment. "You know," he said after a few minutes, "when I signed up for this post, I thought I'd be bored out of my mind. Turns out I'm busier now than I ever was back home." Tanith tilted her head slightly. "Why did you come here?" He set down the screwdriver and leaned back. "I guess I was looking for a change. Things on Earth weren't what they used to be. Too crowded, too noisy. I wanted some peace and quiet, some time to think." "And did you find it?" James chuckled. "I did. But sometimes I think I found too much of it. Gets lonely out here, you know?" Tanith didn't respond immediately. She was focused on the final connections for the booster. But when she spoke, her voice was softer. "I understand that." James glanced at her, surprised by the admission. "You do?" She nodded, still working. "My world was not quiet, but it was isolating. There are different kinds of loneliness." He thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess there are." The signal booster whirred to life, a faint green light blinking on the side. Tanith sat back, examining her work. "It's done," she said. "Looks good," James said, grinning. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure you'd pull it off." She raised an eyebrow. You doubted me? Like they were just two strangers forced to coexist. It wasn't quite friendship, but it was something close. James adjusted the frequency dial on the receiver and leaned back in his chair. The faint hum of the signal booster vibrated through the small outpost as it swept the skies for any incoming signals. Tanith stood nearby, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the blinking monitor. I don't understand how you can just sit there, she said, her tone tinged with impatience. We should be preparing, not waiting. James sighed and tilted his chair back on two legs. What do you want me to do? Run outside with a flashlight and wave it around? This thing's going as fast as it can. It'll pick something up, if there's anything out there to pick up. Tanith gave him a sharp look. You don't take this seriously. I take it seriously, he said, rocking the chair forward and planting his boots on the floor. I just don't see the point in pacing around and acting like we're under attack. For all we know, the nearest ship is light years away. Or it could be right above us, she countered. James leaned his elbows on the desk and looked up at her. You seem awfully eager to find whoever's out there. Why? Tanith hesitated, her jaw tightening. Because I need to know who survived. Survived what? She looked away. For a moment, James thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice low. My ship wasn't just a simple transport. It was a rescue vessel. We were evacuating people from a system that had been compromised. James frowned. Compromised how? Not something you need to worry about, Tanith said quickly. Hey, he said, leaning back again. You don't get to drop a bomb like that and then brush it off. If you're looking for survivors, it means something happened, something big. And if it's headed this way, I need to know. She stared at him, her golden eyes unreadable. Then she sighed and sat down on the edge of the workbench. There was an attack. Not on my homeworld, but on a colony we were allied with. I don't know the details, they didn't tell us much before we were sent in. But it was bad. When we arrived, we found the planet in ruins, the people scattered. We took on as many as we could and left. That's when they came after us. James felt a chill run down his spine. They who? Tanith shook her head. I don't know who they were. Not exactly. Their ships were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were fast, relentless. We barely escaped, but the damage to my ship was severe. The rest of the fleet was scattered. I don't know who made it and who didn't. That's why I need this signal to work. I need to know if anyone else is still out there. James rubbed his chin, processing her words. So you're saying these attackers could still be out there, looking for survivors? It's possible, she admitted. But that's why we need to know. If we find my people, we can regroup, figure out what to do next. James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. And if you don't find them? Tanith's shoulders stiffened. Then I'll find another way. He studied her for a moment. You're not used to working with other people, are you? What makes you say that? She asked, her tone defensive. You've got this lone wolf thing going on, James said. You always seem ready to fight, ready to take on the whole galaxy by yourself. But maybe, just maybe, you don't have to. Tanith's eyes narrowed. And what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you don't have to do this alone. I'm here. Maybe I'm not an elite warrior or a brilliant engineer, but I've got skills. I can help. She studied him for a long moment. Why would you risk your life for me? James shrugged. Because that's what people do. We help each other. It's not always about who owes who. Sometimes, it's just about doing the right thing. Tanith's expression softened. Just slightly. You're a strange man, James. Tell me something I don't know, he said with a grin. Just then, the monitor beeped. Both of them turned to look at it. A faint signal had appeared on the screen, flickering in and out. Tanith immediately leaned over the console, her fingers moving quickly across the interface. It's weak, she said, but it's there. James stood and peered over her shoulder. Can you boost it? I'm trying, she replied, her focus entirely on the controls. It's coming from the far side of the planet. Too far for a direct response, but we might be able to triangulate the source. James grabbed his jacket. Then we'd better head out. Tanith glanced at him. You don't even know what's waiting for us out there. That makes two of us, he said. But you're not going alone. Let's go. She hesitated, then nodded. Together, they gathered their equipment and set off. The terrain was rough, but James had grown familiar with the planet's surface, and Tanith seemed to move with ease despite her injuries. They worked together to navigate the rugged landscape, taking turns using the scanner to track the faint signal. As they climbed a particularly steep ridge, James reached out a hand to help Tanith over a loose patch of rocks. She paused, looking at his outstretched hand before finally accepting it. Thanks, she said quietly. No problem, James replied, pulling her up. When they reached the top, the signal was stronger. The scanner displayed a series of coordinates that led them to a small canyon. In the center, a small, battered pod sat partially buried in the sand. Looks like it crashed, James said. Tanith approached it cautiously, her weapon drawn. James followed, keeping an eye on their surroundings. The pod's hatch was partially open, and inside, they found a single occupant. A young alien male, barely conscious but alive. Tanith, James said, gesturing toward the figure. He looks like one of yours. She nodded, quickly moving to the pod. She spoke softly in her language, and the male's eyes fluttered open. He muttered something in a weak voice, and Tanith's expression grew serious. What is it? James asked. Tanith shook her head. He says the attackers are still out there. They're searching for survivors. James felt a lump in his throat. Then we need to get him out of here. Now. Tanith helped the young man out of the pod, leaning him against her shoulder. James grabbed the other side, and together they began the difficult trek back to the outpost. The weight of the situation pressed down on them, but neither of them spoke. They both knew that their work was far from over and that the quiet planet they had called home might not remain quiet for long. Back at the outpost, the air was thick with tension. James leaned against the workbench, rubbing a hand over his face as he watched Tanith care for the injured alien male. The young man's breathing had steadied, but his color was still off, his eyes half-lidded as he leaned heavily on a makeshift cot. How's he doing? James asked quietly. Tanith didn't look up from her work. Stable for now, but his injuries are severe. He'll need rest, and we'll have to keep a close watch. Any idea what he was saying before? About those attackers? She hesitated, tying off a bandage before answering. He said they're methodical. That they've been searching the area ever since the colony fell. If they find us, her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. James folded his arms. You think they're coming here? It's possible, she admitted. But we can't be sure. We need more information before we make any decisions. Information, James repeated, nodding toward the young man. And how do we get that if he's barely conscious? Tanith glanced at him, her gaze sharp. We give him time. He's been through worse than either of us can imagine. Rushing him won't help. James exhaled through his nose. All right. What do we do in the meantime? She straightened, finally stepping back from the cot. We prepare. Secure the perimeter, reinforce the outpost, and see what we can salvage from his pod. If we're going to stay here, we need to make sure this place can hold. James gestured to the small structure around them. This place barely holds as it is. And if you think I've got a secret stash of laser turrets lying around, you're out of luck. Tanith arched a brow. Then we improvise. You said you've been here for years. You must know the terrain, the resources we can use. You've already survived this long. Surviving on my own is one thing. Fending off unknown attackers? That's a whole different story. Tanith's expression softened slightly. Then we make it our story. Together. James blinked, caught off guard. Her words weren't exactly sentimental, but they carried a weight that he wasn't used to hearing from her. All right, he said finally, shaking his head. Let's get started. They spent the next few hours gathering supplies and reinforcing the outpost as best they could. James showed Tanith the various materials he'd stored over the years, scrap metal, spare parts, even a few old energy cells that still had some charge left. You've been holding out on me, she said as she inspected the pile. Didn't think I'd need to use them all at once, James replied. Most of this is just junk. Junk can be useful, Tanith said, picking up a piece of metal plating. We'll need to fortify the doors and windows first. Then we can set up a perimeter alarm. Even something rudimentary could buy us time if anyone approaches. Sounds like a plan, James said, grabbing a nearby wrench. You handle the alarm. I'll work on the doors. For the next few hours, the two of them worked side by side, exchanging tools and ideas. Tanith showed James how to jury-rig the energy cells into a crude motion detector while he demonstrated a trick for welding the scrap metal into sturdy panels. They fell into an easy rhythm, their earlier tension replaced by quiet determination. "Here," Tanith said at one point, handing him a small device from her belt. "It's a signal scrambler. Attach it near the main console. It'll make us harder to detect if anyone tries to scan for life signs." James turned it over in his hands. "You just carry this stuff around, huh?" "I came prepared," she said, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. He shook his head, chuckling. "Why does that not surprise me?" As they worked, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the outpost. By the time they finished, James was covered in sweat and dust, his muscles aching from the effort. He looked around at their handiwork, the reinforced walls, the patched-up door, and the crude perimeter sensors now blinking faintly in the gathering twilight. "Not bad," he said, hands on his hips. "I mean, it's not exactly a fortress, but it'll do." Tanith stepped back to admire their work. "It's a start," she agreed. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the newly installed devices. James glanced at her, catching her profile in the fading light. She looked different somehow, not just in the physical sense, but in the way she carried herself. She seemed more grounded, more present. "Hey," he said, breaking the quiet. "Thanks for, working with me on this." She turned to him, her golden eyes meeting his. "I should be thanking you. This isn't your fight, yet you've been willing to help." James shrugged. "Like I said before, we're in this together now. And besides, I'd rather work with you than sit around waiting for trouble to find us." Tanith's expression softened. "You're a strange man, James." He grinned. "You keep saying that. I'm starting to think it's a compliment." "Perhaps it is," she said, her lips quirking into the faintest smile. James felt a warmth he hadn't expected. A quiet sense of camaraderie that seemed to have crept up on him when he wasn't looking. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the cot where the young alien still lay. "We should check on him," he said. Tanith nodded. "Agreed." Together, they approached the cot. The young man's breathing was steady, his color slightly better than before. James noticed Tanith's hand linger on the edge of the cot, her fingers brushing against the fabric as if to reassure herself that he was still there. "He'll make it," James said quietly. "He's tough, like you." Tanith looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Toughness isn't always enough." "No," James said, meeting her gaze. "But it helps." She didn't respond right away, but he thought he saw a flicker of something in her expression, something that felt almost like agreement. As the night deepened, they sat by the young man's side, exchanging quiet words about what came next. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, they had each other. And for James, that was more than he'd ever expected.